And they even tried to outlaw calling it a coup. Uh, and it did have a strong popular basis. I mean, there were millions of protesters against the Muslim Brotherhood, against the president, Mohammed Morsi, but it was a coup. I called it a revocation. And when the army first did this, they claimed a mantle of legitimacy coming from the protesters in the streets, and they made all kinds of promises about honoring the goals and values of the 2011 revolution, and even promised to put youth in the cabinet. And over time, they reneged on all of those promises. Over time, they tapped these old establishment guys to be in charge. They just appointed them. They disregarded the youth. And then gradually they made new laws, just by fiat. So they made a law forbidding protest. Well, of course, Mubarak had such a law. But then Mubarak, in Mubarak's era, in the 80s, 90s, zeros, those draconian laws were only sometimes imposed. The government cut student demonstrators a certain amount of slack. But now the Egyptian elite, which was back in power and felt like it had some public backing, that people were tired of protests, they were threatened by the possibility of a far-right religious government on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood, that they had a mandate. And so they actually followed through with the laws. So when Ahmed Maher, one of the leaders of the 2011 revolution, an important organizer in the April 6th youth group, when he staged a protest in late fall of 2013, he was arrested for protesting. And then he was put in jail for 3 years. And he really was put in jail for 3 years. And there was no parole. And he really served out his term. And when he was let go, he was put under probation. And the government claimed that it could call him to spend nights in jail whenever it liked, and were keeping an eye on him. And when he was arrested, you might have expected that all of his old buddies, thousands of youth who had come into the streets in 2011, would go wild and would protest. But no. The government calibrated it. So they saw when the wave of protests had died down, when people maybe were becoming discouraged that they could succeed with these methods of public protest, when they were very threatened by this, possibility of religious rule or theocracy, that was when they started rounding up the youth protest leaders. And they did it at a time when they were virtually guaranteed to face no real pushback. So that's a big sign. At that point where you have protests, you're facing an authoritarian government. When it's able to turn a corner like that and do things to people who were formerly popular and lionized, but now the government would get no pushback for arbitrarily imprisoning people, for doing something perfectly natural like demonstrating. That's a really dangerous sign. And then the secret police, who had been marginalized for a while, started reasserting themselves and started spying. Domestic spying started up again. I went to in 2014, I went to a music concert, and the singer who was going to perform was known to be a critic of General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the man who came to power through the 2013 coup. And so some of the youth told me that the nearby restaurants that were catering this musical event had been contacted by the secret police to know how many orders they had gotten, because they wanted to estimate the crowd size to calibrate how dangerous this event was, because it was a singer who was a critic. And over time, critics just started disappearing. So when I visited Egypt the last time in 2014, I have a Rolodex by now, or an iPhone list of people to call. No answers. Either they were afraid to meet with me, or they were in jail, and the party was over. And then the press had become very lively after the revolution, and was very critical of politicians in general. It was kind of a golden age, I think, of Egyptian press criticism. But gradually, it seems to have started getting visits from the secret police that, why did you publish this and how could you do that? And it becomes more and more tame over time. And then journalists began being arrested and detained, or editors began being threatened behind the scenes. And entire TV channels, especially ones that might be associated with Muslim Brotherhood, or which were on the left and were critical of the government, entire channels go away, not accessible to people anymore, and anchors are fired and so forth. So the press is tamed. That's another thing you have to keep your eye on, is what's happening to the journalists. Not only what's happening to the activists, what's happening to the journalists. And if you can both cow the journalists, and because people start to self-censor. They've got jobs, they've got families, they've got a kid to put through school. How much do you want to really lay all that on the line? And so if it's made very clear to them that they will go to jail for 6 years if they publish an article critical of the dictator, then they have to think hard before they do that. And a lot of them will start being afraid to do it. And that fear, comes back. So that was one of the things that was the great tragedy, was that in the zeros, the youth told me that they had been afraid. Because, the secret police in Egypt, the state security police, they come out to put down a demonstration. They have these shields, and they look like ninjas. They have all of the armor and the vests and helmets, and they really look like almost creatures from another world. And they'll be in phalanxes. They'll all be locking arms and going towards the demonstrators, and they will injure and kill people if they face resistance. So, and then nobody in their right mind would ever want to spend one night in an Egyptian jail. Egyptian jails are not sanitary, let us say. And of course, you're in with people who maybe some of them are violent criminals and so forth. So it's a fate worse than death. And a lot of people have gone through it in Egypt. But you're afraid of being injured or killed by the secret police. You're afraid of what might happen to you in jail. And I know people whose health was permanently damaged by spending time in an Egyptian jail. So there was fear. And they said, on January 25th of 2011, they broke that fear. They became fearless. They were willing to stand up. And of course, there were so many of them that the danger of anything happening to any one person declined. So they had strength of numbers. But by now, the fear is back. And if anything, it's much worse than it ever was before. And then the regime declared the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist group. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood had competed in elections and had a majority or a plurality of the deputies in parliament at one point, and then won the presidency. So they were an ordinary political party by that point. But in the aftermath of the coup, they were declared to be a terrorist organization. That's another thing you have to keep your eye on, is how is the opposition being positioned by the government? And declaring people terrorists is fundamentally anti-democratic. Because terrorism, as a discourse, puts entire areas of discussion out of bounds. So if somebody makes a political demand, minimum wage should be $15, we can discuss that. City councils can take it up. There can be arguments, no, it's going to hurt the restaurateurs, or how can people live on less? Can discuss it. That's politics. That's democracy. But if we say that anyone who says that the minimum wage should be $15 is a terrorist, then there's only one thing to do. Arrest them before they cause any more trouble. And then there's no debate. There's no discussion. It's put off the table. Everything is put off the table. And indeed, those people who are not originally associated with the demand for $15 minimum wage, if they start saying, well, there should be $15 minimum wage, $15 an hour, then they're tagged as terrorist sympathizers, as providing material support to terrorism. So they're made taboo. So calling a group a terrorist group is a way of making a group taboo. Now, there are terrorist groups, and maybe it's a legitimate way to deal with them to apply a set of laws to them that we don't want. We want to economically boycott them, or we don't want it being easy for them to get a hold of C4 plastic explosives because they're terrorists. That's fine. But using that tool of security against a violent group to turn around and use it on a civilian political grouping is profoundly anti-democratic. And that's another step towards dictatorship. And I think Americans should be aware of this particular way of proceeding, because I think they may see it deployed more and more in their own lives. And we've already got to the case where some of the protesters against the North Dakota pipeline more or less being treated by law enforcement as terrorists, even though they were nonviolent and they were simply protesting. But deploying these kinds of tools that maybe are legitimately deployed against groups that want to disrupt society through mindless violence, deploying them against civilian protesters who are not using violence, that's a sign of creeping authoritarianism. And it's something that I think after 9/11 became an enormous challenge for American democracy. It's even to the point where our American Supreme Court at one point said that it's a form of material support to terrorism to give advice, say, to a group that's been so designated like Hamas. Well, what if you gave them the advice that they should be less violent? According to the Supreme Court, that would be material support for terrorism. And then it also, giving advice is a form of speech. Well, I read the Constitution to say that the Congress and the U.S. government and the U.S. courts have no business interfering in people's speech. You can regulate activity, but you can't. It's a blow to the First Amendment to say that giving advice to a group designated by the State Department, and who are they? Who elected them? As a terrorist group makes you an accessory to terrorism. So this has already happened in the United States. We're starting down this road of a creeping authoritarianism. Certain groups made taboo, certain kinds of speech disallowed, and in the face of the clear text of the U.S. Constitution, it'll be to the point where we're not allowed to write or read certain kinds of books and so forth. This is a slippery slope, and the U.S. public, I think, is insufficiently alert to how this is happening. Again, the Fourth Amendment requires a warrant for government invasion of your privacy, your personal effects, your papers. I consider my email to be my papers, but the government increasingly is disregarding the requirement for a warrant to look at our personal effects and our papers electronically under certain circumstances. Or the warrants are issued in secret, or they're sidestepped by what's called a national security letter. Well, this is the same kind of technique that the Middle Eastern autocracies use. They have entire banks of hackers that are watching people, watching how they move money, watching how their email. Even one Tunisian activist wrote about how she was frustrated because she often had trouble getting into her email. It just, when she went in, put in her password, and was trying to get in to see the messages, that it would hang up for a long time. And she finally figured out this was because the government people were in there. So she would start leaving them sort of messages that, look, I check in at 3 p.m. Could you please do it some other time? And so you become aware that you're under surveillance. And of course, that's a disciplining feeling, to know that you're under surveillance, or could be. And the Snowden revelations have made it quite clear that the government allegations that they don't spy on, Americans on U.S. soil are simply untrue, or that they have tools where they certainly can do that. And there have even been revelations of employees of the National Security Agency who spied on their ex-girlfriends and were stalking them, basically, illegitimately using these tools. Well, that's the tip of the iceberg, because do we really trust that our governmental, that our president, that our cabinet, that the heads of these secret agencies always obey the rules, always obey the Constitution? What check and what balance is there on them? And as for the courts, there is a secret FISA court. The evidence is that they're a rubber stamp, that they never said no to anybody. Surveillance is another sign of growing autocracy. And while the argument could be made that it's good for society that the government be aware of the activities of certain people who are maybe planning terrorist attacks, there's not good evidence that the government, through surveillance, has ever broken up a major terrorist attack. And the fact that terrorist attacks still happen from time to time, as a scientist, their tools are obviously not working in that regard. And the Snowden revelations are that they're using this surveillance ability internationally for things like business espionage, keeping an eye on the Brazilian oil company and things like that. There's nothing to do with terrorism. It's about making sure U.S. government and corporations remain on top of the world. So these forms of surveillance, intimidation, and so forth are ways of keeping people supine, of making them afraid to organize. And I think, the fate of the United States as well as of these Middle Eastern countries depends on people being able, on there being a feedback loop. When the government does something that's harming people, that's not good for them, the government should be able to hear about it. It might be good for a corporation, a particular corporation, or a particular set of people, but it might be bad for the general public. The government has to have a feedback loop, and that's the glory of democracy, is that it's a continual feedback loop. And it's how the United States has amounted to something in world history, is that it has that. But if a corporation couldn't put a coal mine into your neighborhood, or a coal plant, I mean to say, into your neighborhood without your permission, and ride roughshod over you, and then spew sulfuric acid and mercury and other toxins into your children's mouths, and then also spew carbon dioxide into the atmosphere so that they're making the world unlivable for future generations, for your children's children and their children, and you have no recourse. And if you protest, you're a terrorist, then that's a very, very dangerous future for our country and for the rest of the world. That kind of thing is actually happening in places like Egypt and Syria and so forth, because there's been this reassertion of autocracy. And now all the tools the youth had developed to try to fight it have been figured out by the secret police, and they're blunting them. But it is possible that these same techniques increasingly will be applied by the United States deep state. And that is something, if the American people allow it to happen to them, they will truly and deeply regret it.